Hello and welcome to today's webinar on data management basics. My name is Anka Vlad and I work in the Research Data Services team here at the UK Data Service. And my colleague with me today is Katie Laley, who will be helping me with any questions you may have during the webinar. The structure of today's webinar is a 40-minute presentation followed by 20 minutes to answer any remaining questions. The slides of this webinar will be placed online on our website so that you can use the information and links it contains. A recording of this webinar will also be placed on YouTube if you'd like to come back to it at a later point. Let us begin. Just to give you a brief summary of this session, I will start with a short overview of who we are at the UK Data Service and what we do, and then we will go through different aspects of data management. We will take a short look at GDPR, some consent considerations, anonymization, access controls, documentation, security, encryption, and backups. And then we will answer your questions. Just to quickly mention that all the information presented in this webinar are just highlights touching on the most important aspect of data management. There's more detailed information available on our website, and we have various other training materials, as I mentioned before, available on YouTube, and the links to these materials will be provided at the end of this webinar and throughout as well. So the UK Data Service is funded by the Economic and Social Research Council and is a single point of access to a wide range of secondary social science data. We provide support and training for data creators with accessing, managing, and sharing and using data, of course. This is delivered by staff based at universities across the UK, including here at Essex, University of Manchester, Leeds, Southampton, Edinburgh, and UCL. The UK Data Archive here at the University of Essex manages the UK Data Service and archives the data. Background. So data sharing is becoming more and more important across multiple disciplines because it provides benefits not just for ourselves as researchers, but also to our institutions, our funders, and the general public more widely. It is essential here that we have good research data management habits, because if you do not deal with data management considerations early on in your project, it can lead to potential problems later on. For example, if adequate consent is not obtained to share the data collected, or if complexities of data anonymization are not considered early on, it might lead to more work down the line. The core message here is to think about data management throughout the whole life cycle of the research project, and perhaps write down a data management plan to enable you to keep track of actions and who is responsible for what. Nowadays, many funders and publishers have specific requirements for data handling and require a data management plan, also called DMP, included in the initial grant application to ensure that researchers have considered these aspects early on. So why is it so important that we manage research data well? Well, to begin with, data creation in research is often expensive, and this is not just in terms of money, but also in terms of the time invested in creating and documenting novel data. That, and of course, that data itself is the cornerstone of research, and the hope is that, well, good quality data should lead to very good quality research. Furthermore, this data underpins our published research findings, and by ensuring that we manage our data well, this enables us to comply with ethical codes, data protection laws, journal requirements, as well as our funders' policies. It is also important here to protect what might be personal as well as other types of data from loss, destruction, and of course potential exposure. Some very simple and practical steps that researchers can take would be firstly writing a data management plan at the very beginning of the research project. This is now a requirement for both funders, for most funders, to ensure that aspects such as storage, processing, access, and destruction are thought throughout the research project and in advance at the beginning of the project. It is very likely that there will be local support at your university or institution that can help in this regard. We also have extensive guidance on our website on how to write a data management plan, and a link to the template, that we have available will be provided at the end of this webinar as well. Also very important is that data can be shared with others and understood at the point of using the data. It is therefore essential that consent for sharing is obtained from participants. Depending on what participants agree, we might not be allowed to disclose their identities, and here anonymization and access controls are essential. We also need to to think in advance about the type of software and the formats we choose for our data, using formats which are closed or proprietary, mean that others may not have access, or that standards might change and develop over time, which might mean they're not compatible with new versions. It is also essential that we provide context or metadata, what we call metadata, and documentation with our data so that others can understand the data that we collected. And finally, of course, it's important to ensure that we protect the data throughout the project lifecycle, as we discussed before, by means of secure storage and encryption. Next, I wanted to have a look at the different sections that a data management plan should ideally touch upon. These include an assessment of any relevant existing data that might be of use, so that collection of new data might not be necessary or can perhaps be restricted, or establishing that there is no similar data available, which means you have to collect new data to base your findings on. The DMP should also describe in detail how you're planning on going about collecting this new data and from who, etc. This is linked to procedures you will set in place to ensure that the new data collected meets certain quality standards. How this data will be stored, hopefully securely, and where it will be backed up to avoid data loss. Another section should address difficulties foreseen in sharing this data for replication or reuse, be it in an archive or an institutional repository. For example, if secondary data is used, that might mean that copyright will prevent you from disseminating that data at the end of the project. Or it might be that the appropriate permissions need to be set in place to allow you to archive that data. Another very important section is around issues of consent, anonymization, and potential reuse strategies, followed by a section on issues of copyright and intellectual property ownership. Think about who will own copyright over the data you collect. Would it be yourself, your institution? Will your participants maintain copyright over their data, or will there be shared copyright? It might be the case that you need to address this in your consent form or your information sheet. Another aspect to consider is who in the research team will be responsible for which parts and aspects of collecting, storing, backing up, encryption, cleaning, anonymization, and archiving the data. Finally, there's a section on data management and curation. You can find more information using the link provided on this slide. Here, please make sure to read this carefully. It will provide more substantive information than I've provided here, more extensive information. At the UK Data Archive, there are a variety of ways in which we protect participants' identities while ensuring that you comply with your legal and ethical obligations. We refer this as a three-step approach. To begin with, it's important to ensure that you seek informed granular consent to share and preserve the data in the long term. Following from this is ensuring that you protect your participants' identities at all times in line with what they've agreed in their consent forms, of course. This can be done by anonymizing the data. It might be that you do not need to collect someone's personal information if this is used for administrative purposes only. The point here is to only collect the data, and especially personal data, that you need for your particular project. The third aspect to consider is access regulation, which is normally needed for data that even after anonymization still contain a residual disclosure risk, as we refer to it, and data cannot be anonymized sufficiently without reducing its reuse potential. So with the GDPR now in place, we updated this presentation to include some summary information on this. Although we will not focus too much on this today, we just wanted to remind you of some of the considerations researchers will need to have in light of this relatively new piece of legislation. I'm sure you are aware the new General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, is the new EU-wide data protection regulation, which means that there's no need for any implementation legislation to be done within a country, i.e. countries do not need to bring in any national legislation to implement it. The GDPR itself aims to modernize and unify European data protection rules to harmonize them across all member states, and it does create some new rights or it strengthens some previous rights as well. But what is essential for us as researchers to consider in our research projects it's just about ensuring clarity, transparency, and accountability to our participants when we are collecting their personal data. So the GDPR applies to personal data as defined under Article 4.1 of the Act as a piece of information that can be directly or indirectly identify an individual. Pseudonymized data is also covered, depending on the circumstances around it and the way it's been protected, and it applies to living persons only. So, for example, if an individual was deceased, the GDPR does not necessarily apply anymore, although there might be other ethical issues to consider, such as potential harm inflicted to any of the relatives of the deceased. One other thing worth pointing out here is that not all research data is personal data, but there might be some personal data in your research data, so it's about identifying really what is personal data and what is not. So again, we talked about accountability and transparency. So within the GDPR, there are 6 processing grounds for processing data. It might be that this is done based on consent of the data subject. There's a need to process the data for the performance of a contract, or there's a legal obligation placed upon the controller, or necessary to protect vital interests of the data subject. It is carried out in the public interest or in the exercise of an official authority, also known as public task, or it is a legitimate interest pursued by the controller. There are various guidance coming out as well, and it would be worth speaking to your university or institution really, your ethics committee and data protection officer about this to identify which processing grounds apply. So now moving on to the first stage, we identified before the idea of consent. What normally is the case when researchers deposit data with us is that they drafted excellent consent forms to address engagement in the research project, so participation, so that their participants understand what it entitles and what they are engaging in, what their rights are, etc., as well as how this data might be disseminated via publications, personal website presentations, etc. The part that is sometimes left out, however, is consent for data sharing, which needs to be addressed separately from participation in the study and dissemination via research outputs and the research itself. Data archiving for future reuse, it needs to be, of course, discussed separately, and it must include information on where the data will be archived, for how long. This should be checked with that individual archive or repository in advance. However, here in our case, at the UK Data Archive, the data is preserved indefinitely. Also, it must mention who will the data be accessed and used by. Consent for, just lastly to mention that consent for archiving and participation should be an opt-in option, and it should be granular. So every type of data should be addressed separately on the consent form or in detail in the information sheet. So we've recently updated our model consent form, which you can find on our website, and the link is provided at the bottom of this slide as well. Our template consent form can be used by anyone and adapted to your particular project. It contains really 3 sections. The first looks at consent for participation, so taking part in the project. The second is the use of the information collected, for what purposes it will be used, so publications, creating materials to be published on a website, for example, or the project website. And finally, the last section looks at this data sharing issue. So informing participants about any possible future reuse or reuse of the information by others. Moving on, just to have a look at possible wording that can be used in a consent form. So the first example here is taken out of our new model consent form. It looks at gaining permission for specific data to be archived in a specific archive or data repository, and as you can see, participants have the options of ticking yes or no. The gray box includes different other options that you might want to think about to include in your form, depending on your project. So this is looking at the type of data, the granularity we spoke about earlier. It might be that participants agree to having their anonymized transcripts being deposited, but they might be opposed to having their photographs or videos archived, in which there might be identified. Also, important is to mention whether data will be anonymized and to what extent. This should be discussed in detail in the information sheet. Finally, make sure to inform your participants about the possibility of applying access restrictions on the data you're archiving. Some participants might be under the impression that their data will be openly available on the internet, which is of course not the case. The second statement we included here is just to illustrate an example of how you can phrase the potential use of extracts of interviews and photographs. Moving on to anonymization. And what exactly you should be looking at if you're doing this yourself. I've split this into quantitative and qualitative data. Quantitative data, the first thing to think about is removing direct identifiers. These are items which would allow you to identify, or anyone to identify, a particular individual, i.e. names, addresses, institution, the exact job title, etc. In the process of anonymization, we can simply remove them, or if possible, we can reduce the precision of detail through aggregation. So, for example, occupational categories would be used as opposed to the exact job title, or an area would be used instead of the village. A similar method can be used for low-count categories. Of course, this applies to qualitative data as well, where you might only mention the year of birth of an interview rather than his full date of birth, which is more disclosive. Restricting upper and lower ranges of a variable by recoding them into categories, or banding them, as we call it, would help hide outliers. Examples here are very young or very old participants relative to the rest of the sample, of course, similar with income or other variables, depending on your project. Looking at qualitative data in particular, some of the same applies, although there are a few other issues that need considering. For example, making sure to avoid blanking out text that can be reversed. To use pseudonyms to remove direct identifiers but still leave some information in the data. For example, replacing the name Laura with Emma would not allow identification but would still inform future users of the gender of the participant. Just to give an example, to save yourself some time, ensure to plan and apply editing at the time of transcription. If there are multiple teams working on the same project in different locations, for example, or perhaps just multiple people working on transcription, ensure that their methods are consistent throughout. Then also very important, and I could not stress this enough from a data reuse point of view, make sure not to over-anonymize. So removing too much information can make your data unusable, unreliable, or, I don't know, misleading to future users perhaps. A very interesting piece of this on this subject was written by Karen Gush, who worked at Understanding Society on maintaining a balance between confidentiality commitments to her research participants and the usefulness of the data for future researchers. She discussed consent, anonymization, and access controls as well, and you can access that using the link here. And finally, of course, it's very important to keep an anonymization log of all the replacements, aggregations, or removals that you've made during the anonymization process. What do we need to consider when we're collecting audiovisual data? So although this can be anonymized, of course, it's considerable more difficult. Options are voice alteration or image blurring. This can be, of course, very labor intensive, and it may diminish the reuse potential of the data. A better alternative would be to obtain consent to archive this data under appropriate access restrictions. Another thing you can do is avoid using disclosive or personal information throughout the recording if you're recording your interview. So for example, avoid using the interviewee's name or agree from the very beginning of the interview on a pseudonym that you can use throughout. So next we have an example of an interview transcript and how this has been anonymized. So here, as you can see, I'm sorry for the image quality. The name of the interviewee has been replaced from Lucas Roberts to Ken. The day and month of birth have been removed, only leaving the year. You can proceed similarly with your interview transcripts. And of course, all the names that are used here are fictional, just to mention that. We have extensive guidance on anonymization on our website. Please make sure to check this. So moving on to access regulation, at the UK Data Archive, we operate a three-tier approach. The first is open access, which is available to anyone from our online catalog without the need to register or assigning a license. This is applied to data that's been categorized during our disclosure review as non-disclosive. All identifying information have been removed before publication. The second category is safeguarded, and there are different versions of this option depending on the data in question. Safeguarded data can be accessed by registered users only, who have signed our end-user license as part of their registration. But depending on particularities of the data deposited, it might be that special conditions need to be met in order to access the data, such as obtaining the depositor's permission first. Embargoes can also be applied for limited periods of time to allow the researchers to publish their findings. And finally, we have controlled access, and this is where we would have very sensitive data or data that cannot be anonymized without making it unusable for future users. This is available for remote or safe room access, and the researchers need to complete a training course and pass a test before they are granted access to this data. Here we have an example of a data collection with multiple data folders archived under different access conditions depending on content and consent obtained from participants. So we can apply access restrictions for each individual file or folder here at the archive. In this case, we have interviews and diary transcripts, which can be accessed by registered users only by logging in. And we have audio files, which are more disclosive, which can only be accessed with permission from the depositor. And you can use the DOI there to access the collection yourself if you wish to, just to have a closer look. So moving on, let's now look at how to best document our data to make it reusable. So the most important thing here about documentation is simply that it should allow other users with no prior knowledge of the data to understand it and possibly reuse it correctly in their projects. What information would they need to make sense of it? That's something that you can ask yourself before depositing data. If they never had a look at it before, if they have no prior knowledge of it before, what would they need to understand it and possibly reuse it in their project? Here at the UK Data Archive, we archive this as supporting documentation in our collections. It also allows us to ensure accurate processing before we publish the data, and it helps us during our data disclosure. In terms of what exactly should be included as documentation when archiving data, examples include a methodology file explaining how the data was collected, so sample size, fieldwork, protocols, codebook, user guide, blank versions of the consent form and information sheet used, questionnaire, data list, and we will have a closer look at this in a moment, as well as any links to reports or publications. Looking at data level documentation, so ideally all structured tabular data should have adequate variable names as well as variable labels and value labels. In terms of variable names, here are a few suggestions, the most important of which is to ensure that they match question numbers in the questionnaire used. Also, it's important to use meaningful abbreviations, and for interoperability across platforms, variable names should not exceed 8 characters. Looking at variable names, variable labels, some of the same applies. Make sure that they reference the question text and that it includes units of measurements if that is appropriate. Valuable labels as well, ensure that these are described and that missing values are declared and differences between them are recorded separately. So, for example, missing information or unanswered questions as opposed to skipped questions during a survey. So next I wanted to include some information about user guide, what a user guide should contain, and give you an example. A user guide can include any project-specific information that would be needed to understand the data, such as an interview schedule, methodology, study findings, consent procedures, transcription notes, codebook, etc. If you would like to see an example, you can see this collection available from our catalog here. For more information, the user guide is open access. We spoke earlier about a data list that can be archived along with qualitative data, and here's an example of how this could look like and the information it can contain. Again, this is a project specific, and you might be collecting different information in your research. We refer to this here at the archive as a map to the collection, as it provides an at-a-glance summary of all the files archived. It's very useful for new users, as it is for yourself if you come back to your project in a few years' time, for example, and you need to remember who are your participants, or perhaps somebody else is interested only in a subsample. For instance, in this case, perhaps somebody is only interested in farms larger than 300 hectares, and so they would know exactly where to look at, as opposed to having to scroll through all the files. When we think about transcription templates, these should possess a unique identifier and adopt a uniform layout throughout the research project. Speaker tags should be used to identify who is speaking and when, include line breaks, and be page numbered. Every file should have a document header giving brief details of the interview and interviewee or focus group participants. As an example, here you can see how a transcript can look like and the information it should contain. It is clear who is speaking when in this case. So we have YE. It is clear who is Y and who is I. There are line breaks in between, and there's useful information at the top about the interviewee, so the name, the gender, the occupation, so there's information both about the interviewer and the depositor. There's information about the date when the interview was conducted, and you can also include the place of the interview, etc. So really, this is project specific, and you can include any information that is relevant to your project. You can have a closer look at this example using the link provided at the bottom of the slide as well. Another very important aspect to consider are file formats, making sure we consider what are the most appropriate software to use for the research you're undertaking. As I'm sure you are aware, digital data is very much software dependent. It's worth pointing out that for long-term preservation, the best formats to use are standard, interchangeable, and open software. And for more information on what exactly that means for the data you're collecting, you can see our guidance on recommendable and acceptable formats using these links. Other practical considerations during your project include making sure you organize the data and documentation logically and in a manner that is easy to understand. Make sure to group files by date, data type, or location. For example, if the project covers more than one location. Also make sure to use version control for files if needed, so that it's easy to identify which is the final version of a document. We will now look briefly at data security and storage issues. It is very important when collecting data to think in advance about mechanisms and procedures that need to be put in place to prevent unauthorized access, use, change, disclosure, or destruction of the data. What are possible solutions and how to go about adopting a data security strategy? So some of this information is perhaps very basic, but it's essential to avoid the issues we spoke about in the previous slide. So controlling access to computers by using secure passwords and locking our computers when away, ensuring that our antivirus protection is set up to date, that we protect our computers from power surges that might render them useless. Restricting access, particularly to sensitive and personal information, is essential. Always making sure to keep them separate from anonymized data. Ensure that you utilize encryption across all devices and at all locations. This is a safer, more secure option than simply using passwords. For instance, if someone were to steal or have access to your laptop, they can access your files even if your laptop is password protected, simply by removing the hard drive and installing it into another device. Finally, ensure that you properly dispose of unwanted copies of the data and equipment at the end of the project. What is vital to remember here is that personal data needs more protection, really, than anonymized data. So while some solutions might be appropriate for some types of data, they might not be for data that contain personal information. Because we touched on encryption, this slide provides you with some options. Just to mention that we do not recommend one in particular. You might opt for one over another depending on your operating system. For instance, what exactly and for what exactly you need encrypted, depending on that. Whether you wish to encrypt an entire hard drive or just a particular file or folder or a USB drive. At the bottom of the slide you can find a link to our UKDS YouTube playlist, which contains several tutorials on different encryption software developed by our colleague Scott Summers. And here are some more links to YouTube tutorials that you can use, that we have produced. Hopefully you will find them useful. Another aspect to consider is having a digital backup strategy to avoid data loss and data destruction. And there are multiple things to consider here. So what do we need to back up, where, what type of media we can use, how often we need to duplicate or synchronize the information that is backed up, for how long do we need to keep it there, and here there might be different data retention policies that apply as advised, for example, either by your ethics committee or your funder. Also, it's very important that you check these backups regularly to ensure that they're still in working function. You might wonder why this is so important. So there have been multiple cases recorded, some over social media as well, where the only copy of the data has been destroyed. For example, during a firehouse where it's been stolen or forgotten on a train. So having a data backup is in a secure location prevents you from losing time-consuming work, really, or results that you've been working very hard on, or having to collect new data. So just looking briefly at file sharing, so we often need to share files with our research partners, and doing this over email is not really considered best practice. And there are other options, as I'm sure you're aware. There are virtual research environments available, or locally managed, such as OwnCloud or Zen2, which we use here at the university, or physical media can be sent encrypted through the post. There are cloud solutions such as Google Drive or Dropbox. However, we have to be cautious really about security concerns here. There are some options that claim to be more secure. What we recommend here is just to assess the risk of using cloud storage, whether they're appropriate for your data, and a very good idea would be to ask your university or institution for advice on this. Here at the archive, we do not advise storing personal data or commercially sensitive data in the cloud. For more on this, you can check our guidance online. Moving on to one of our final slides, just looking at data disposal. This is very important to consider at the end of your research project. If we have personal information or copies on hard drives, if we simply delete that data that is not typically sufficient, deletion only unflags the files. So if we write over the data by reformatting, that is also not sufficient. If it's incredibly sensitive data we're talking about, the only way of ensuring complete destruction of that data is to physically destroy the hard drive. And there are specialist services that can do that. Again, you can check with your university what is their guidance on this. As I said in the beginning, this presentation was just a summary really of the main aspects that need considering during your research project. We have, however, a lot of useful information and resources on our website, including recurring webinars such as this one, workshops and other training materials. Please have a look at them for more information. As mentioned during the presentation, we have multiple templates and model forms and examples available on our website, and here are some links to some of them. Perhaps you'll find them useful as well. As mentioned as well, we run multiple workshops and webinars, and here are a few examples. So we run webinars on data management, key issues in reusing data, finding and accessing data in the UK Data Service, guided walks through our self-deposit repository reshare, and you can subscribe to our mailing list, follow us on Twitter, or watch our tutorials on YouTube as well. As we mentioned before, to keep in touch, you can use the information here as well as our help desk, who will then forward your query to the relevant team here at the UK Data Service. Thank you very much for joining our webinar. I hope you found it useful. I hope it answered some questions, and we look forward to hearing from you.